How about in today's video, I'm going to show you how to make a badass whiskey bar out of either a whiskey barrel or a wine barrel. I've been saying since pretty much I started my channel almost 2 years ago that as soon as I reach 1,000 subscribers, I'm going to show y'all how I make one of my whiskey bars. And I'm a little late on that. What's up, y'all? My name's Andy. This is Epeius Garage. I'm nearly at, well, no, I'm over 2,000 subscribers now, not too far after that, and I'm finally making do on my promise for y'all. The reason being is I needed to wait until the right time to make the barrels. I was waiting for some orders in the right order, where I wanted to show y'all a whiskey and a wine. I don't just go making these on a whim, because they take up a lot of space, and I want to make sure I have a buyer. Good thing is y'all are going to actually see me make a wine barrel for the first time ever. I've made a ton of these out of whiskey barrels, but I'm going to make one out of wine barrel as well, and there are some differences, and I'll go over all that in the video. As always, I'll link all the tooling and all the material I use to make these barrels. Feel free to go through it, and any of it you think you might want or need. If you decide to make these yourself, I'll have it there at your disposal. First off, you're going to need to get yourself a barrel. Not just any barrel, but a whiskey or a wine barrel. Personally, I like working with the whiskey barrels. Of course, that's the only thing I've really worked with so far. We're going to find out in this video if this is that much different. You might ask, what's the difference? Well, the obvious difference is a whiskey barrel holds around 50 gallons. The wine barrel is roughly 59 gallons, and they're not as consistent in shape and size. Another obvious difference is the depth of the top. The wine barrel has a much deeper top, whereas the whiskey barrel is a much more shallow top. I pay anywhere from about $100 to $125 for a whiskey barrel, and that's directly from the distillery. Now, some distilleries are really proud of their branded barrels, and they'll want to charge you a pretty penny. I want to say TX Whiskey here in Fort Worth, they were charging like $250 a barrel, and didn't matter how many I bought or anything. Of course, they do put work into their barrels. They're very nice. They're kind of, they got a sealant on them. They've got the stencil on the sides, 2 places on the sides and 1 on top. So they're very nice barrels, no doubt, but $250, I don't think so. Either way, whichever way you go, just remember whatever you pay for the barrel is going to end up increasing your end cost if you're going to sell these. And there's already a lot of cost involved in these, so I try to keep my costs as low as possible so it's a better sell for the customer. Now, I'm no expert on barrels, but I thought I would give you a quick rundown on the anatomy of a barrel and what things are called. So we'll start off with the top. The top is called the head, the round piece that's on top. The wood pieces run along the barrel. These are called staves. I think that's the proper pronunciation. I don't know, but if you know a different way, tell me. The metal bands are called hoops, and the hole on the barrel is called the bunghole. Yes, the bunghole. I can literally hear Beavis and Butthead saying that and repeating that in my head right now.
I think it's bunghole. Yeah, that's it. Bunghole.
Now, you're going to see a little later in the video that the inside of this barrel is going to be charred. I don't know what the wine barrel is going to be like, but there are different levels of char. I don't know them exactly, but I know I've had barrels ranging from 1 to 4, and they'll be stamped somewhere on them. Not always. This one does not have a stamp of the char, but I know when I had a char 4 barrel, it was like alligator skin, like burnt really bad. And what that is it's based on how long they held the fire inside the barrel. And what a lot of whiskey makers want is maybe more char to flavor their whiskey when it's aging in there. It might give it a smokier flavor. It's all about flavoring. That's the anatomy of a barrel. What can I say? Generally in my videos, I'm trying to keep them to 10 minutes. However, this video, I don't care, because I've been wanting to do this video a long time, and I want to make sure to show you every detail. So the next thing I'm going to go over is all the material I use for one barrel. Let's start it off with fasteners for the hoops. I generally use these black panhead 3/4 inch square drive screws. However, for the wine barrels, they're zinc. They have zinc hoops. I'm going to use these zinc hex head. Epoxy. I don't use epoxy on every barrel, but generally the whiskey barrels are very uneven. I started using epoxy on them to level them out. Lately, I've had customers where I've been putting brands and other stuff. You'll see in this build later on, I had to order a really cool decal for this customer. I think it's going to turn out awesome. Stay tuned and you'll see that. Next, brackets. These are for your shelf. I used to make my brackets, pain in the ass. I now buy these metal ones. They work fantastic. They come in packages of 4. Y'all, the plug-in. This is very important. Do not go cheap on your plug-in. I would definitely recommend this one. It is UL listed. That means it's gone under rigorous testing by the Electrical Society. I'm not an electrician. I don't know any of you electricians on there. Maybe put some more clarity in the comments for it, but you want to use something that's good. It's not going to burn down your house or your customer's house. Handles. These are the handles I choose. You can get any handle you want, y'all. I'll link these. I like them. They're hammered metal. They look cool. I always use these. Motion sensor, y'all. This is what allows your barrel to turn on, or the lights to turn on whenever you open the barrel door, or you leave your barrel doors open and you walk up to it, the lights come on. It's kind of cool effect. There is a way, if you read the instructions on this very carefully, that you can set the timer inside of this thing. It's really weird, but you can set it for how long it stays on. It's like a little tiny screw. I found that out recently on a couple builds ago. Kind of interesting. The LED lights. Oh, almost dropped it. 16-foot strip LED lights. You'll see more of these later. They're flexible. They've got a sticky back. I don't use that. I've got some little clamps that I use for it, for the wiring. Speaking of wire, here's the wire I use. I forget exactly the name of this wire and what kind it is. I will link it though and you can check it out, but it's specifically for this LED setup. These are little wire brackets, mounting brackets. They're little plastic brackets that hold the wire in place in the LED strip. You'll see more of that later. Male and female plugins. I want to say these are CCTV for camera, but they also, you can use them for your LED lights. They work great. I'll probably use all these on there. Switch. This turns it on and off. So if you don't want your lights coming on, you can turn it totally off. Or if you want to dim them and brighten them, this does all of that. I incorporate this into my wiring system. Hinges. Y'all do not go cheap on hinges. I get these at Lowe's. These are 3-inch, 5/8 radius, heavy-duty hinges. Beginning of my first barrel builds, I bought some chintzy hinges. Don't do it. Get good ones. This is kind of cool. This is a locking hasp, so you can lock your liquor up. You'll see this later when I apply it, but you don't have to put this on if you're not worried about kids or whoever getting in your barrel. Don't worry about it. Totally optional. Shelving. I use a 3/4 inch by 24 inch by 4 foot prefabricated shelf, basically. The barrel shelves are about 21.5 inches wide. So this gives you 2 of them. I already had half of another one. That's going to make all 3 of my barrels. I cut them in a circle, put an edge on them. Again, I'll show you later. That's it. Again, you'll see me use all this later on in the video, and I hope this helps you to build your barrel. Now, this next part, you don't always have to do. When I get my barrels fresh from the distillery, there's usually no rust on the bands. I give them a quick cleaning, and then I usually put a coat of spray lacquer on there. This all depends on the look you're going for. If you want a rusty look and just let them rust, that's fine. I generally clean them up like I did in this case with a wire wheel, and then I just put a quick coat of clear lacquer on the bands, and that's just to keep them from rusting in the future. You know, it's going to be inside. I don't think anybody wants it all rusty. That's my opinion. I got my barrel prepped on the outside, whereas I cleaned up the hoops. I use my wire wheel to clean up some unsightly stuff. Basically, it's ready to go. When you first get your barrel, make sure using some self-tapping screws. I use the Panhead square drive 3/4 inch self-tapping screws on mine. But as soon as you get that barrel, you need to put 4 of these in every single hoop. If you don't, your barrel will eventually it'll like melt and fall apart, because moisture keeps these barrels taut and they expand. Without that in there, they dry up and they will just fall apart. The hoops will fall down and it'll turn into a mess. So do that when you first get your barrel. Okay, just a little tip. Now, using my impact and a square tip bit, I'm going to go around and start putting these screws in all the hoops. How I do this is I generally start at the top hoop and I put a screw in every other stave or slat or wood, whatever you want to call it, every other one. Then when I go down to the next hoop, I will put them in every other one on the opposite ones. This ends up working out really well for me. You don't use as many screws and it becomes very rigid and very secure. When I do the first top 3 hoops, I flip the barrel over. It's a little more ergonomic than trying to do this on the ground or trying to get close to the ground. This is long and drawn out, so I'm going to keep going. We'll get back to the rest of this next part, cutting the door and figuring out the door. All right, first barrel is done. Turn this bad boy back over. That's it. Those screws make this way more rigid. You can't even move it or shake it without that. See if this one's like that. They're a little more shaky. Honestly, the wine barrels I'm starting to notice are just made better. Of course, these are from France. Those are a buddy of mine. I don't know. We'll see. That's one of the differences maybe. But now, start planning those doors. It's time to map out the door. Now, on my barrels, I generally make the bunghole at the very back, and I use that as a reference to kind of find the center line. You're going to want to find as close to center line to where you want it as possible. One of these seams is going to be your center line. So generally I'll come back here, I'll look, there's my bunghole. Basically follows this line right here on top and right here. Top of my door, bottom of this ring, bottom of my door, top of this ring. I've decided this seam right here is going to be my center. So this is what I do, and this is kind of black, is I make a light mark. I could take that mark off later with a wire wheel or something, or sand it a little bit, but that's going to be my center. Now, I use a sewing tape, and what I do is I go from my center line, it's right here, and I go around and I get as close as possible to 13, 14 inches. So in this case, it's 13.5 inches. That is going to be my other edge of my door, and I'm going to mark that. A good way to mark this also is a piece of tape. Actually, you know what? I'm going to do that. So I'm going to put a piece of tape right next to it and put arrows marking that's one edge. Then I'm going to go to the opposite side. I'm going to do the same thing. Center of my door, right here. That's going to be my side door. Another thing that I do that helps me when I'm cutting these bands with my cutoff wheel later on is I draw the line on the band that I'm going to be cutting. So there's no mistaking where I'm going to cut. Door's laid out. Now that I know where my door is going to be, I have to add some more screws around the door to make sure it's fully secured and it's not going to move around. So knowing where all my lines are. I know this is the center, so I'm going to make sure screws on every single one of those. Closer to the edge, the better. On the edges, where I know my door edge is going to be, screw that down. Closer to the edge, again, is better. All the screws, every single stave or board, whatever you're going to call it, needs to have a screw in it on the door and around the edge of the door. My favorite part, cutting the barrel open. This is a very satisfying part of it. To cut the barrel open, I'm going to use my multi-tool with a wood bit. All I'm going to do with this is I'm going to go on the top of my doors where they need to be cut from edge to edge all the way across, and I'm just going to score it basically. And then on one side I'm going to go all the way through using this, enough to where my jigsaw blade can go in. And then once I get my jigsaw blade in there, I'm going to use the jigsaw to actually cut the tops. Now, you are not going to have to cut any vertical up and down cuts because we're going to use the staves lines where the boards meet together. They're just in there with pressure. That's it. There's nothing glue. There's nothing holding them in. So that is your vertical line. So the center and the edge already have a line. You don't have to cut that. It works out really good. Hey, I almost forgot to mention, before you cut your doors, you want to mark each door. What I do, since I have 3 barrels, I'm going to name this one B1, and then one door will be B1 left or L and B1R. The next barrel will be B2L and B2R, so on, depending on how many barrels. That way these go directly back to your barrel, and I also mark an arrow pointing up. I'll show you. So here's my line. I'm going to put this in a better spot, or center of the door. So see, there's my lines right here. This is the edge of my door. Make sure your marks are where they need to be before you start cutting. I got my door scored on the bottom, across the top, and then I went through. Now, jigsaw. Before I switched to my jigsaw, I went ahead and made sure that I could get the blade in there. Jigsaw blade is a little thicker than the multi-tool, so that's the next step. Now, cut them off, and that's it. After that, we'll have to cut the bands, but as far as the door, it'll all be cut. Now we're going to cut the bands. Cutting the bands involves a cutoff wheel. If you're using a 4.5-inch grinder like I am, and you're not familiar with it, you go buy one for this project, please get familiar with it. These can be very, very dangerous. I'm familiar with them. I have a welding background. That's what my original trade was, so I'm very familiar with them. Make sure you always have the guard on, safety glasses at minimum, and ear pro. If you have a face shield, it's even better. I don't. This does generate sparks, so make sure you're not throwing sparks on anything flammable or that you don't want burnt. So those are just some tips. Let's get this thing cut, and we're going to have doors. Remember, I made those lines on the metal. Those are going to be my cut lines. I'll show you. I want to see what the inside of a barrel looks like. Here you go. This one is a whiskey barrel. You can see the char. This one has pretty good char. I would say it's probably like a 3 or 4. If you're a whiskey barrel expert, let me know. That's it.
And I did the same process on the other two barrels, the wine barrels, and I found no difference in any of these barrels.
Doors are cut. Now it's time to do the cleanup part. There's a few things you got to do when doing this. I'm going to show you an example. So this is the whiskey barrel. As you can see, it's pretty charred. Stuff flakes off real easy. Stuff like this, I'll take a wire wheel, my 4.5 inch grinder, and I'll clean this off, brush it off. I'll do the same with the inside. Now the wine barrels, which I've never done one before, and these aren't charred wine barrels or anything, must have just been plain oak. Just got a red hue to them. Probably just going to wash these out. No need to do anything crazy with those. Now, two more tools I'm going to use. Wire wheel, clean off that crusty, char stuff. And then I'm going to use a flapper disc on my other 4.5 inch grinder. Y'all, this is why you buy Harbor Freight 4.5 inch grinders. I got two of these for like 30 bucks. Goes out, so what? We're going to know I'm 14. Anyways, moving on. But this flapper wheel, I think it's like 60 grit. I'm going to use this around all the edges where the metal, make sure there's no sharp edges, kind of clean up the cuts and the wood. This works best. You don't want to use a hand sander or anything like that. So that's the next step.
I started with the wire wheel, but it was messy. I went with a hand wire brush and then vacuumed it out, and then I rinsed it with the hose. For the wine barrel, it wasn't bad at all. All I used was a vacuum, and then I went around all the edges of the metal banding with that flapper disc to round them off, make sure they're not sharp.
My next step in this process is making the shelf and a very special little bracket. Now, I've made these shelves multiple ways. I've been doing these barrels a while. One of the ways is I've used old heads from the barrels. Pain in the rear, I promise you, getting them together. So far, the best way I've found is this 3/4 inch by 24 by 48 inch board at your big box store. It's pre-made shelving is all it is. Solid wood, already jointed together. Get 2 shelves out of this. Generally, my shelves are about 21 to 21.5 inches wide. That fits in the barrel very well. And I don't have a circle cutout jig yet for my router. Need to make one, I know. And I don't have any other good way of doing this other than I take a piece of string, I put it in a circle to half the distance of what I want. I mark the center of it and I circle it and make my shelf. Then I take my jigsaw and I cut it out. Once I cut out that first one, I just use that as the template. From there, you can sand it, you can put some type of bevel or some type of edge on it if you like, however you want your shelf to look. That's all I do. Also, while I'm doing this, there's a bracket that I make. This bracket is made out of a 2x4 cut directly in half. I cut it 4.5 inches long, and when you cut the 2x4 in half, it comes out to roughly 1 5/8 inches. If your saw blade is an 1/8 inch wide, you lose that 1/8 inch in the curve. Then I cut one end at 45 degrees. I put a groove down the middle. This is going to be for wiring later. And then I put these 2 holes here, pre-drilled holes for screws. And what this does is this goes underneath the shelf, and your motion sensor is going to go on here like that. And what that does is it puts your motion sensor, I don't know if y'all can see this, at a angle. If your motion sensor is like this, it doesn't have very much space to catch any movement. You want the motion sensor kind of pointing at your door and out the door. This allows the lights to come on with the motion sensor. So this little bracket's kind of important for your lighting later on. What I usually do is I batch out several of these depending on how many barrels you think you're going to make, or maybe you're going to make more in the future. Make like 10 of these, just put them somewhere, then you have them. You don't have to make them again later. That's the next step.
Ran into our first significant difference between the 2 barrels. I first took some measurements of the wine barrels versus the whiskey barrel, and there's a big difference. There's about 2 or 3 inches difference in width. So if I use this size right now, it'll have 2 or 3 inches on each side and it's not going to look right. So what I got to do is make a bigger piece of wood. My obvious choice is I have this other piece of pine. I'm going to join it to the piece I already have, and that should give me enough room to make a bigger shelf. That's where we're at.
I used my table saw to joint the edges of each board. Then from there I brought them to my table. I put them together to see which way looked the best, and I did a dry fit in my clamps. Then I added my Titebond 2 glue and I glued them up. Let them dry for a couple hours. Turned out great. Seamless seams.
Well, my jointed board is over here drying. I'm going to keep moving on. The next step for my shelves, what I like to do is I'll get a piece of oak. I usually got a bunch of this cut off pieces from other projects. I'll, sand it down, maybe put a little bevel on it, whatever, pre-drill my holes, countersink them, and this is going to be a support for the bottom of the shelf. Then of course I'm going to add my motion sensor bracket, and what this does, I usually put it a couple inches back, 2.5, 3 inches is fine. I just kind of eyeball center, and then your motion sensor will go on here, and that kind of tilts the motion sensor where it can catch the motion of somebody walking up or when you open the doors. If it's flat underneath there, it's not going to catch as much motion unless it's directly under it. So you tilt it out to get the motion out. That's how I do it. I'm sure there's other ways. Once I secure these, then I'm going to probably flip it over, and I usually put a profile on top, like a bevel edge or something, just to give it a profile. Sand it down, and then I stain them. The whiskey barrel's usually a little darker, so I always stain them this early American. It always seems to go really well with the whiskey barrel. For the wine barrels, they're a lighter color. I may do a different color stain on those. I don't know. We'll see. See how it looks. Time to wire the shelf. I always wire this first because when I flip it over, it's going to be upside down, and I generally screw it all in with the brackets, and you don't want to wire all this upside down or turning your barrel over. It's a pain. So what I did is I started wiring it just like this. I don't have any stigmatics or whatever you call them, wiring drawings. I don't have any of that. What I have is a picture, and I'll post it on here, put it up here somewhere, and that way you can see it. It's pretty simple, but I start with my motion sensor. Now on the motion sensor on the back, there's a little hole, and you can put a little tiny screwdriver in there, and you can adjust how long this turns off. With that, that's going to go there. The in power comes through this way. I put it off to the left. The out power is going off to the right. You will need your LED lights. You'll need a female connector to connect that. And then I always test it. You can plug in your plug-in. And see, I'll plug it in, lights up. Usually goes off pretty quick, but if I do some motion, it's going to go back on. Now, I tested this one. It's staying on for about 23 seconds. I turned it all the way down. That's about where I like mine. You can turn it up where it stays on longer. It's all up to you, and you just adjust it on the motion sensor. Few things to think about. You may want to get you one of these little electronic repair kits. It has a lot of handy stuff in it, like a small screwdriver. You're going to need some of your brackets. You're going to want to put these down as you're going around to harness all your wiring. Little wire cutters and wire strippers. These work really well. And generally I use some hot glue. I'm all out of hot glue. I'm going to have to go get some. But what I use it for is I kind of put stuff in place so that it stays there, and then I come behind and I put the harnesses, the wiring harnesses down behind that, so it's very secure. As these barrels get moved over time, they get jarred and so forth, you don't want your wiring all falling down. That would be bad. Figuring out this wiring did take a little practice, but I can give you some tips.
1, use your hot glue to hold it down until you get your harnesses on there. 2, remember, positive to positive. They all have positive signs, and make sure your red wire is going to the positive and so forth. 3, make sure that you test it before you're done. And once it's tested and it's working, get it all nice and secure so you know it's not going to come unsecure. On the wiring connectors that go to your lights, you may need to pry up the little pieces of metal so your wiring goes underneath there without getting frayed. Just a little tip.
Time to install the shelf. What I've made for my shelves to get the right height is this little jig here. This jig sets the bottom of my shelf right at 14 3/4. So it puts the top of the shelf, I'd say around like 15 1/4. So I do this just to get the initial height and to kind of hold the shelf in place for me while I put in the first bracket. Once I put in the first bracket, I pull the shelf out, and then using a straight edge, I go around and install the other 3 brackets. This way they're all level and I don't have to have the shelf in there kind of hindering the way. But you will have to make sure that your shelf brackets are setting in a place that's not going to hit any wiring or anything like that, because if you're doing it the way I do it, your shelf is already all wired up. Then from here, I use the screws that came with the brackets. It came with some Phillips 3/4 inch screws. These screws did come with some of those drywall anchors, but if you're putting them directly into the barrel, you're not going to need the drywall anchors. All done.
After getting the shelf in place, I started by drilling my hole for the wire in the back of the barrel. I made it just big enough for the cord to fit through. Then from there, I start stripping my wire, and this one is going to be the female connection because it's always male and a female. And from here, I plug it in, measure about how long my wire is going to need to be to the dimmer. Then from the dimmer, I can wire up to the lights that are on the shelf. Once you know everything works and you got it all in place, I go ahead and I take some hot glue and I put it over a lot of the wiring and the fittings, and this will hold it down even more securely. Then I go ahead and add some wiring harness to any wiring that is dangly or off of the bottom of the barrel. Then that bottom wire is going to run up and hook into your shelf, and then you'll take the shelf and you'll go on up and you'll continue up the barrel on the right hand side. From here, I take my wire, the excess wire I had on my shelf, measure it out where it needs to be, and I hook it up to my LED lights. The LED lights have a sticky backing, so I kind of use that as the initial. But first, I'm going to test the lights, make sure they work, and then I'm going to get it up there, kind of use some sticky and some hot glue, and make sure that it's going to stick. Once it does, I'll secure it with some wiring harnesses at the end. I'm not really sure why, but this barrel had unusual hoop placement. Generally, there's plenty of room between the 2 hoops to put the hinges, but in this case, I had to actually cut out a portion of the hoops in order to fit both hinges. And you must remember when applying these hinges to your barrel to keep them close, because the curvature of the barrel, the hinges will bind if you have one up top and one at the bottom. It just doesn't work right. Just trust me on this one from experience. But anyways, here I just used my cutoff wheel and notched out where the hinges were going to go. Generally, whenever I apply my hinges, I put both doors in place with a 16th inch shim underneath them. Then I use my level to make sure that the hinge is perfectly, 90 degrees vertical. I also use that level to make sure that it's in line with the next hinge below it. This is important to keep from your door from, binding, and make sure that it operates properly. After I do one side, I'll turn around and I'll go do the other side exactly the same. Then you can take off your tape and you can test them out and make sure that they're working properly. Sometimes after you remove them, there is a little bit of, you got to take a flapper wheel and kind of go around the edges on the bottoms of the door and the top just to make sure if it's rubbing anywhere. But I don't often have that problem. You do want to pre-drill your holes before applying the screws. It is a hard wood, and you don't want your screws to break or strip out on you or anything like that. So I suggest pre-drilling them. As far as hardware goes, I add 2 handles, a hasp it's a spring hasp. It pulls the door shut. And I didn't talk about this at the beginning of the video. I forgot to mention it. But I also add a locking hasp. The locking hasp is 100%, up to you. I mean, really, you don't even need the spring hasp, and if you don't want the doors closing tightly. But that's what I add to my barrels, and I mean, you can get as creative as you want with your barrel. This is just how I do mine, and of course, all this will be linked in the description if you just want to use what I use. I always test my products. It's very important. I test to make sure the lighting's working properly and everything's the way it should be. I still ended up getting a call from the customer, and they were having issues with the motion sensor, doing some weird stuff. Went to their house and I replaced the motion sensor. With electronics, you just never know. This is why I tend to stay away from electronics, but make sure you're testing your stuff, and there could still be problems.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are almost done. I know, finally, right? This barrel is basically complete. It could go out just as it is. All the hardware's there, the doors are there, everything works, the lighting works. It's been tested, it is ready to go. Except for one thing. I offer an option of an epoxy top. The reason why I offer that is because sometimes with whiskey barrels, the top is very uneven. Epoxy is a good way to fill that evening out. You could also use a glass top. Get a custom one made, ordered, put it on top of there. There's other ways. For this barrel, I am going to do the epoxy. I am not going to go into the details of how to pour epoxy because that would be a whole nother video. I will tell you that I use tabletop epoxy. I will link it in the description. You want to mix your epoxy well. If it tells you 3 minutes, mix it for 6. And I use a heat gun. That's basically the basics. I do this in about 3 to 4 pours. I do a couple seal pours, and then I do a flood pour at the very end. This customer has a special request of a decal that's going to go on top. It's really cool. My plan is to pour all the epoxy all the way up. Right before the final pour, I'm going to apply the decal, do the final pour over it so this won't be damaged. Something to consider when you're doing your epoxy pour, and I've had people ask how I keep the epoxy from dripping on the inside. Well, one thing, you might get drips on the inside. My shelf is already applied, so I put paper over it to protect the shelf. Second, if it's an older barrel, the staves have shrunk. You're going to have gaps at the top. I seal those with wax. Be careful with the wax. All I do is I melt beeswax in all these big gaps to keep the epoxy from going in there and dripping down the side. Keep the wax off the main surface. The epoxy will not adhere to it. If you do get it on the main surface, scrape it off. Maybe take some sandpaper, 150, and sand it down so it still has something to adhere to. The epoxy, if it's a smooth surface, it'll just peel up and it'll cause a layer. Sometimes that happens anyways on these barrels due to, I don't know what would cause it. You never know what these barrels have been through and what they have on top and what's seeping through. It's just part of the process, and it gives the barrel character. However, I try to avoid it, and I don't want to cause it with wax. If you would like a detailed epoxy video from me, I'd be happy to make one. I don't do it a lot, but I've done it plenty, and I would do a whole separate video on just the basics of epoxy. Tell me in the comments and I'll do it. Let's finish this barrel.
The epoxy I'm using here and that I linked in the description is a 2-part epoxy, 50-50 of each. I use scales. It's the most accurate way, in my opinion. In this case, being that it's the seal coat, it's a very thin layer of epoxy that I'm going to put on. I only did 2 ounces and 2 ounces of part A and part B. Then I really worked it in using my gloved hand to try to get it in all the cracks and crevices. I'll do this on the first couple pours. Now with epoxy, if you're gonna pour a second coat on top of this, you can pour another one right away a few hours later. Just let this one where it's kind of gets tacky, not all the way hard, and then you don't have to do anything. But if you're gonna let it fully cure overnight, you're gonna have to sand it or rough it before your next pour. Just remember that anytime you let it fully cure, you're gonna have to rough it before you pour something else on because it needs something to adhere to, what we call a surface profile. I poured 2 seal coats. First one, I didn't let it fully cure. I poured the second one on top. The second one, as you can see here, is fully cured. It's hard as a rock. So before I do my third pour, I'm gonna go ahead and sand this with 150, 200 grit sandpaper. Just give it a light sanding. You don't have to push too hard. You wanna wear a dust mask. The particles are not good to breathe in. But from here, I'll do this and I blow it off with air, and I use some denatured alcohol to wipe it down, get all the, dust flakes and so forth off. Then you're ready for your next pour. And it really is the same process over and over and over. I think for this total job, I did about 5 to 6 pours. Once you get to the thicker pours though, I start using a heat gun. I can, link this in the description if you like, but this helps remove any bubbles. When you get those thicker pours, you're gonna need a heat gun. Some people use a torch, but you gotta have this, otherwise you'll have bubbles all in your epoxy. This customer was an active duty military couple, so thank y'all for y'all's service. And they wanted a custom decal to be applied, or I guess their unit logo. I didn't get the backstory on it, but it was really cool. So what I'm gonna do here is the same process. I'm gonna rough up the surface so we have a profile for the next layer to stick to, clean it off like before, and then I'm gonna apply the decal. Now my thinking for the decals, instead of putting it directly in the center, I moved it up towards the front where the doors are gonna open. My thinking on this was if they ever wanted to put anything on top of the barrel, they could set it up there without covering the decal and obstructing it. So you would always be able to see it. That was my thought. I think they liked that, but that's how I did this one. Now you'll notice me kind of heating up the surface and all that and the decal with my heat gun. The reason being is it was cold that day. It was kind of chilly, and generally you want decals to be at least 45 degrees and the surface temperature to be 45 degrees. So the air temperature was pretty good, but the surface temperature was kind of cold. So I wanted to make sure I heated that up before I applied the decal. Checking level for the 5th and final pour. Saw that it was a little off, so I go ahead and use these shims. I always link these in the description. They're very handy, but I use those to get the bubble where it needed to be on the level, make sure that the barrel was level, and then same thing, y'all, same process. Gonna do the final pour. Now this pour, I went ahead and did, I believe, 11 ounces and 11 ounces. So it was a thicker pour. You want to make sure, they call it your flood coat. You flood the surface, and that's what's gonna give you the nice, even, smooth surface when it all cures. And that was it. This cured beautifully. There wasn't, I think, a single bubble in this. And I think the decal looked really cool being suspended inside the epoxy.
I almost finished them. Couldn't quite do it due to time restraints. I finished my total commission job. I wanted to get that one done. The others are for my buddy. He's not in a hurry. And all I got left on him is adding the hardware and putting the shelf in and adding a few wires. Other than that, it won't take long to finish those up. And I figured out all the differences anyways. The main difference with these is the shelf size. It's bigger around. You can't use the 21 and a half inch that you use on the whiskey barrel because it'll leave you too much space around the edge. I had to make bigger ones. Other than that, basically the same. If you stuck around for a whole video, thank you. I know this was a longer one, but I wanted to put more detail in this and really go over it, so I didn't really care about how long it took. Generally, I try to keep my videos around 10-minute mark, but this one had a lot to it. I hope I captured it all for you, and you can go ahead and make your own.
Feel free to send me any pictures on my Facebook page if you do make your own barrel bar. I'd love to see your take on them and what you do. That's it. Thanks for watching. I'll see y'all next time.